Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. And this is a real pleasure for me today because I have the opportunity to interview a man who I very much respect for his journalism acumen and his ability over the years to just tell stories consistently and in several different incarnations. I've worked with this gentleman since 1999, and I have the pleasure of working with him again in the last 7 years. And he just is a jack of all trades and somebody who I really admire for a lot of reasons. So it's real pleasure today to be able to talk to Mr. Tom Bolton. How are you today, Tom?
I'm really well, Josh, and thanks so much for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, thank you. I've been looking forward to this. I want to talk to you and introduce you a little bit to people who may not know Noozhawk. Obviously, a lot of people do know Noozhawk, but can you tell me, Tom, what it is that you do at Noozhawk and what role you play, and what role does Noozhawk have in this community?
Okay, sure. Yeah. Well, so my title is executive editor, and in that role, have the overall responsibility for the news department operations. As you know, we have a very small news department, although I think we certainly punch above our weight and are very efficient in what we do. And I think we have an incomparable team. I am also one of the co-owners of Noozhawk. There are three of us, Bill McFadden, who founded Noozhawk, myself, and then Kim Clark, who's our VP of business development and basically runs the advertising side of the business. So that's a different hat that I wear in terms of helping to, guide the business part of what we do. But most of what I do is overseeing the news department. And again, as you know, everybody in our news department, regardless of title, is a reporter and is a photographer, and we all do a lot of on the ground journalism. And frankly, that's one of the things I really love about Noozhawk is that we get to do that. So often when you become a more senior editor in a news organization, quite frankly, you kind of end up as an administrator, and that's important work, but I really enjoy the reporting part of it and the true journalism part of it. As to what Noozhawk is, we are, I think, the best comparison would be we are the online version of your daily newspaper, general interest daily newspaper. We cover pretty much all the goings on in the community. I think we focus a lot on breaking news because people are very interested in that. That really drives a lot of our traffic. But that's only a part of what we do. We also cover local government. You, of course, cover the city councils. We cover school boards. We cover the nonprofit community. We cover sports, really more than anyone else in our community. So it's your daily newspaper. Is just there's no paper.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, I work at Noozhawk. You're my executive editor, and we definitely punch above our weight. I think that's a really good way of phrasing it. I want to talk to you about you, Tom, and what you do specifically. A lot of people are familiar with you in the context of, wow, that Tom Bolton has breaking news all the time. You have so many breaking news bylines, and it's really just kind of part of your skill set. You're a manager, you're an editor, you do so much that people don't see. But what people do see is the breaking news, the car crash, the fire, the accident. So much of what happens in this community, Noozhawk, and I don't think anyone would dispute this, even our competitors. Noozhawk has it first, consistently, always. And that is you. That is, I mean, for somebody who works at Noozhawk, that is you. Obviously, you work with everyone else to help create that, but you're the one who's leading that charge. Can you talk to me about what that's like? How can you be such a prolific breaking news reporter?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is because of my job, Josh. I'm at the desk, most of the time. I mean, that's the kind of work I do. I sit at a desk at a computer, as opposed to yourself. You go to a council meeting or school board meeting, or you go out to do interviews. I do far less of that. So by virtue of that fact, I'm also listening to the police scanner all the time. I'm monitoring social media. I'm monitoring the various sources that we get, email that we get breaking news from. And so it's very easy for me to just quickly bang out at least the start of a breaking news story. And, I'm not the only one that does that. John Magnoli, our managing editor, does it. Janine Scully in the North County, our North County editor, does it. And all of you do it as well. But realistically, I'm the one who is, like I say, generally sitting at the desk. And so I think that's why it looks like I'm like more immersed in it than might otherwise be the case, especially for someone with my title. I find it interesting, and I also know that our readers really depend on it. With the internet today, there's this expectation that news or information is just going to be instantaneous. Just something happens and it's just going to be on the internet, and that doesn't just happen. I mean, somebody has to actually do that. And it's sometimes funny because there'll be an incident going on, and then we'll get an email. It's like, why haven't you reported on the fire down the street? And it's like, well, the fire engine hasn't gotten there yet, and yet there's an expectation. And certainly we play to that. We want people to think that if something serious is going on in their community, in their neighborhood, that they can come to Noozhawk and in most cases find out something about what's going on.
And how do you do that for people who aren't familiar with how journalism works in the newsroom, or during the pandemic, we're all working from home? Are you listening to the scanner and you've developed this knowledge of how to hear the scanner and what is news and what isn't? Can you talk to me about that process? Because
Sure.
You're on it really quickly, and that's not a skill that a lot of people have naturally.
Yeah, well, no doubt the police scanner is an important part of that. And it's the emergency personnel, they have their own lingo. They don't say, always, they don't always talk in words. A lot of what they talk in is codes. So they'll say it's an 1185. We need an 1185, which means they need a tow truck. They don't just say, hey, we need a tow truck. And they've got a whole giant list of codes, and they do tones to dispatch the fire agencies. And so, yeah, you listen to it. I have it on pretty much all the time in the background. And I've gotten to the point, I'm fortunate that I have a very high tolerance for distraction. So I can have that, in the background, and it doesn't bother me. I think other people would probably go crazy. So we do that. We monitor social media. I'm on Twitter all day long. And I am, many of the public emergency agencies will tweet out when incidents are going on, vegetation fire, motor vehicle accident, what have you. We monitor our competitors because they're out there doing a lot of what we're doing. And so it's just that combination. So let's say we find out there's a vegetation fire that's been reported up at Hollister Ranch. That just happened recently. So we listen, and we listen to the scanner. And when the first units get on scene, they will typically provide what we call a size up. And basically they're going to say, they're going to tell the people back at dispatch what they think is going on. So it's okay, we've got a vegetation fire burning on Hollister Ranch. Right now it's 2 acres, moderate rate of spread in, whatever. They'll give it those details. And so we listen to that. And then from that, you size up, okay, well, what is this worth? A lot of times a motor vehicle accident, once they get there, they'll say, well, this is non-injury. For the most part, if it's a non-injury accident, we won't report it unless it's causing a major disruption. And as we've seen remarkably often in the last few weeks, if you get the crash in the right place on 101, it shuts down the freeway. And that causes a huge impact, not just for the people on the freeway, but for the people in the surrounding neighborhoods. So we want to get something up as quickly as possible that says, here's what's going on. The Highway Patrol has a website that puts out all their dispatch information, so we can go and look and see what they think is happening. And so you've got all these little places you're going to get information, and pretty quickly you can write at least a general account of what's happening. And then we will update those as time passes, as we get more details, as we're able to talk to public information officers or pick up information that they're sending out on social media. We have photographers who respond to many of these incidents. They'll be sending in photos, so we can add those as well. And so some stories may get updated, several times before the final version.
Do you get tired? How do you push through? I admire what you do because I'm my age and I know what I'm capable of and I know my limits. And, when you've been in the business for a long time, you evolve, you change, and some things get a little bit more difficult. Some things become a little bit more easy to manage and handle. Can you talk to me about how you stay motivated to cover so much volume for Noozhawk when there's a million other things you could be doing probably?
Well, I believe in journalism and I believe in what we do. I think it's really important. It always sounds kind of Pollyannish, but I think it's an important element of democracy. So that's always been a motivation for me. I think it is probably for you as well, and for most of the journalists I know. Yeah, no, it can be very exhausting. One of the best journalists I ever worked with was a fellow named Alan Parsons, who was the executive editor at the News Press at one point. And one of the things he often said was that, one of the most important qualities of a good editor, and I think it's true of a good journalist, is just stamina, is just being able to keep coming back and doing it time and again. There's times with all of us, I think, that we get tired and maybe we don't deliver as good a result as we might otherwise. But, I know there's people out there that depend on us. And I think we've built that trust and that expectation. And I just feel like we have to live up to that. Part of it's delegating, learning to, get other people to be involved as well and not trying to do everything yourself. On a small team, that can be challenging because, as you well know, we just don't have a lot of folks contributing our content. The good news is we've got a great team. We've got great folks. And I think that makes a real difference.
You mentioned Alan Parsons. I wanted to flash back a little bit when I was hired at the News Press in 1999. I was like just very young, I wasn't that young in age. I think I was like 24, but I was young and inexperienced and not, it takes a few years to figure out what you're doing when you start out. And I remember being so intimidated by everyone who worked there. It was this incredible building. It was owned by the New York Times. And I remember you very clearly, you always wore a suit. You were the managing editor at that time. When you would walk in the newsroom, I would straighten up a little bit. Tom's around, Tom's listening, and Alan Parsons also, he was the executive editor. And
right.
It was a really remarkable time because everyone who was in the newsroom during that period, I think, was really good, and they got better. They constantly improved. There was active management, and there was just a little bit of a kind of just a capturing, sort of magic in a bottle for a little while there. And that's when I came. You were there before me. Can you talk about those days when you were the managing editor, and what was so special about that time? Of course, nothing's perfect. I'm sure a lot of people don't like what we did at that time too, but there's always those critics, but it was a really good newsroom. Can you talk about what you recall about those days?
Sure. Yeah. But the New York Times era at the News Press was really special, especially at its peak. First of all, you have this, company that is really truly dedicated to quality journalism. And of course, we were separate from the New York Times. I mean, they were their own world, and we didn't really intersect that a whole lot. But the company really believed in quality journalism, and I think at the peak they owned about 30 newspapers around the country, and we were one of them. And just their commitment, they brought resources in, they added staff, they allowed us to add staff. They provided training that was unlike anything we had ever seen. They bring in people sometimes from the New York Times to mentor us or to work with us on different aspects of what we were doing. And at its peak, it was a really great, mid-sized newspaper, small to mid-sized newspaper. And I'm really proud of a lot of the work we did in those days. And there was, different editors over the time, and they all had their kind of style and approach. But if you just look overall at the kind of work that was being done then and the size of the staff, I think at the peak we had I think 70 people in the newsroom. I mean, there's probably not 70 journalists in Santa Barbara County today. There's probably maybe half that.
Yeah.
And yet that was just at the news press. So it was a lot of fun. Now I will say that, in the later years, as the newspaper business started to, I won't say collapse, but we'll say retreat, the days weren't as good. A lot of those resources were taken away or weren't there anymore. But if you look at the glory days, and I think you kind of hit it right at the sweet spot when that was happening. I'm really grateful I had that opportunity. I got to work with some great people, Alan among them, David McCumber, Rusty Ryan. I remember sitting at lunch with, the Sulzbergers. They'd come out every once in a while, and once in a while you would get invited to go. And, for a guy who, I was not young, but I was not like some veteran of the big leagues, and that was pretty cool.
Yeah. I like this podcast because I can say things to people that I wouldn't really have a forum to say one-on-one without it being too awkward. But I want to ask you about this. Is one thing that I really notice about you and appreciate as somebody who's worked with you over the years is you're consistently reliable. You always are the same. You always give a reasoned, well thought out response and reaction. You aren't up and down. I don't want to, offend anyone. You aren't emotional. You look at every situation objectively with the facts, the pros and cons. You do kind of a cost benefit analysis for almost everything consistently. And that really blows me away because as we're journalists. We work with all kinds of weird people and personalities, and there's all kinds of weird stuff, and people are great journalists. Sometimes they're not great people. You kind of have to learn how to live sometimes in a state of dysfunction in a newsroom, and journalists know what I mean. Good people, but lots of different emotions there. And you are constantly somebody who I can go to and expect a answer that is the best answer for the greater good consistently. And I don't know that I've ever worked with anybody like that. And you don't also, what's the word? You don't sort of cater to what you think somebody wants to hear. That's the interesting thing. There've been many times when I've asked you things and you've never couched it or phrased it or coddled it so that, let me just tell him this to make him feel good. It's consistently the best advice for the situation. And that's rare in my experience working with anybody and working with journalists. Can you talk about your upbringing and where that comes from and why you approach things that way? Because it definitely does stand out. You're the most steady, reliable journalist I've ever worked with.
Well, it's very kind of you to say that, Josh. Some of it, I suppose, is just my personality. I think I learned at a pretty young age. I used to be more volatile, and at some point I sort of decided that really wasn't a very effective strategy. To get really mad or yell or scream or whatever. That wasn't going to help me achieve whatever my goal was. I've also been involved in managing people for a very long time. I did it in college. I think I was the editor of the Daily Nexus at one point in the college, and my other jobs, I pretty always quickly moved up into management or supervisory kinds of roles. And I think I just found that my whole point is I'm trying to get people to do the best job they can, and so how's the best way to approach that? And, there's different approaches, and there's sometimes you need to be a little bit more coddling of someone because you're trying to build them up. And I certainly do that from time to time. But I found is that people react to, they just want clear guidance, and they want you to be straight with them. And that's what I want people to be with me. I don't like people that play games. And so I've always tried to approach, I think, probably life that way. And again, I think a lot of it's just my personality. Where did it come from? I don't know. My dad was an attorney, and he was not someone who ever yelled or screamed, and same thing with my mom. So maybe I just parroted some of that behavior. Um, but I think that part of success to me for anybody is just showing up. I don't care what kind of work you do, whether you're a journalist or you're a plumber. Show up, do it the best job you can, and be fair and be straight. And I just believe in that, and as an approach to life. And it's amazing how many times I'll shake my head about some situation and say, why can't people just do their jobs? Or just do what they're asked to do in a reasonably competent way? I'm not just talking about journalism, I'm just talking about anything. And how often it's just like, gosh, why can't people just show up and do their job? So I try to model that, I suppose. And at this stage of the game, it's probably just ingrained in me.
Yeah, well, there's so much to be said for somebody who works with you to know that you're going to be consistent every time, because that's safe. And when you create that environment, you do get employees such as myself who are like, oh, I got to get this done. You raise the bar. You don't want to disappoint you, because you don't disappoint anyone else. And so trying to keep pace with everybody, with you, is, I think, a really good goal that people have. And you create that in people just by your stature and your demeanor. Let's go back a little bit. Where did you grow up? Did you always want to be a journalist? I always thought in my head, I think Tom wanted to be a firefighter, just in the way you cover fire, and you're so knowledgeable.
Yeah, I could have seen that. I mean, as I got older, I admire particularly the fire. I admire all the emergency services workers and the first responders, but the firefighters in particular have such a brotherhood, and I guess it's also a sisterhood now, whatever you would call that, but a fraternity, I find it really inspiring, and the way they stick together. But I don't know, I never really considered that. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in the 60s and 70s, so it was a different era back then. I got involved in journalism in high school. I was basically a frustrated athlete. I went to a very big high school, played a little bit of lower level basketball when I first got to high school, but I wasn't good enough to make varsity in a school like that. There's just no way. But then I discovered, you could do sports writing, so I could still be involved in sports, which I liked a lot, and in a different way. And so I started taking some classes, and then that kind of evolved out into other kinds of journalism, news writing, etc. Working on we had a little weekly high school newspaper that I worked on. And yeah, by the time I was going to college, I pretty much knew that I wanted to be a journalist. I went to UCSB, which is not necessarily a destination that you go to for journalism. There's no journalism school there, and at the time there was almost nothing. Today they've got a great writing program and whatnot that gives much more opportunities. But they have this thing called the Daily Nexus, and one of the really good things about the Nexus, and probably one of the bad things, is there's no adult supervision. There's no journalism program overseeing it. So there's a heck of a lot of hands-on, you got to figure it out. You learn from the people that are already there. Again, I started in the sports department, doing sports writing in my freshman year. And then halfway through the year, the sports editor just quit. And they're kind of looking around saying, well, heck, who's going to be the sports editor? And they said, do you want to be the sports editor? I was like, well, okay, which was kind of unusual that a freshman would get that job, but it was more just I happened to be the warm body who was still there. And then that kind of just continued on through my college career. I pretty much only half jokingly say I pretty much misspent my college career at the Daily Nexus, but I learned a heck of a lot, and that's really, what prepared me to eventually become a professional journalist.
Mm-hmm. In high school, you were on the paper. Was it a story? Was it a teacher? Was it just you liked the fact that you could have impact by reporting and then, seeing how people reacted to your stories? What was it that made you think, I want to be a journalist in high school?
Yeah, it's first of all, I've always been good at writing. And so I liked writing. As soon as I didn't have to take more math classes, I didn't. I'm not bad at math, but I just not my thing. But I liked writing. I took creative writing classes, And yeah, there was an impact. You would go cover the high school football game, and then, people would talk about it. Like, your story is what they're reading for the account of that game. And that's kind of cool. And just seeing that, yeah, you could affect people in a positive way. I mean, in high school, I don't know how deeply I was thinking about all that. I thought it was fun to do. But I could definitely see it as a career. And so I sort of kept pursuing it as I got to college.
Yeah. And so when you were on the Nexus, I had heard some story. I don't know if this is wrong. I'll just throw it out there. You were at the time the Nexus was funded by the administration, and maybe during your tenure you switched to advertising based, and maybe you had a role in that. Is that true? Partially?
Not quite. So there is a story there, though. So when I was at the Nexus, and this is in the late 1970s, so this is a heck of a long time ago. At the time, the paper was funded two ways. There was a part of it was through student fees, and not from the administration, but from the associated students. And then most of the revenue was from advertising. But the part that came from the student fees was at the time was controlled by the student council. And, every once in a while they'd get uppity, and, there was always some fight going on about money. And so that every few months they would threaten to take that money away from the Nexus. They get mad at something we reported or whatever. And so the year I was editor, we got kind of tired of this. And it was called a bylaw lock-in. So it was a guaranteed money, but it was by a bylaw that the council had passed, and they could just pass it to get rid of it. So we decided that we would go out to the students, and we did what was called the Communications Amendment. And so it was a constitutional amendment, which then the council couldn't override. And we teamed up with the radio station and the yearbook, the other student media. And we went out and got this amendment approved that made it basically a solid guaranteed lock-in that nobody could take away from us. And it was still only a minority amount of our money. I think as part of the process, we doubled the amount just for the hell of it. And but yeah, so that was a long time ago. I think it persists to this day. I don't really know how, what their funding is. I know advertising is, been very difficult for the student media over the last few years, and certainly through the pandemic. And most of them are doing mostly online now, and not, any kind of physical paper. We were the Daily Nexus. It came out 5 days a week. So there was printing going on, which, again, I don't think much of that happens today.
And did you go straight from UCSB to the News Press, or did you have some jobs in the middle there?
No, my first job out of college was at the Santa Maria Times. I was hired as the education reporter. And I went up there, and I was there for 2 years. Started as education reporter. Then I was in a one-person bureau up in Arroyo Grande covering basically South San Luis County, which was one of the best jobs I ever had. It was it's all by myself. I could basically cover anything I wanted, and the bosses weren't around. So it was great. And then I ended up there as in an editing role part of the time, did some reporting, but I started doing basically helping put the paper together, and I used to put out the Saturday edition. So I was there 2 years, and then that's when I went to the News Press as the county beat reporter.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so you've covered so many beats, county and education. It's so helpful when you're managing people, at this stage of your career, because you're able to say, I've been there. Can you talk about your family? I know you're very proud of your children, and you have made it work here in Santa Barbara, working for different publications. Can you talk to me about Tom the person, and what's your family situation look like?
Sure. Well, I'm married. My wife, Joan, is a landscape designer, and she does a lot of residential landscape designs. She specializes in native and drought tolerant kinds of plants and whatnot. She's been doing that for, I think, close to 30 years now. I have 2 children that are both grown. My daughter, Laura, is the older one, and she lives in Virginia with her husband. And our only grandchild, Henry, who we're very proud of and dote on. He'll be 5 later this year. And she runs a food website that she does very well with, doing recipes and whatnot. And she went to UCSB as well, so a fellow gaucho. My son, Timmy, is almost 5 years younger than she is. He went to college at Cal, and he works for the city of Santa Barbara in the long range planning department. I think you probably run into him from time to time. And in fact, he just is moving over to become the staff person for the whole downtown State Street project.
Okay.
And he started there as an intern and has moved up to where now he's I can't remember his exact title, but he's some sort of a planner. And he's done very well. And he lives here in town, of course. He has a house over on the west side.
Yeah. As a dad myself with 2 kids, it's really difficult to be a great journalist and be a great dad because there's only so many hours in the day. So it's always one of my goals to balance the two. Can you talk about the life of a journalist and what that means? I think a lot of people, obviously we have great respect in our society for public safety, police officers, firefighters, doctors, nurses. There's these certain professions that people really acknowledge as like, wow, it's such a sacrifice what you do. I think less so with journalism. I think people take a lot of journalists for granted in that we have to make a lot of sacrifices to fill the paper or to have several stories in the carousel or, a Noozhawk or just kind of feed the beast. Can you talk about how you've been able to balance the two? And I'm sure you've had to make a lot of sacrifices too.
Yeah, no, it's challenging. You're right. And I admire, you do a really good job of that. I know your kids and what you do with them is really important. Yeah, I think that journalists overall are not appreciated the way they should be. I think often they're maligned unfairly. There certainly are bad apples. And you see, I think, more egregious examples on the national level than you do at the local level. But still, if you take a poll, journalists, I think maybe we're a notch above lawyers, but maybe not. We're not up in the higher echelons of how we're held in esteem in the community. Most journalists that I know that I've worked with, and I say the vast majority, work very hard, are decent, honest people. They're trying their best. It's not a profession where you make a lot of money. Almost nobody's getting rich being a journalist. So it is challenging. I know there's things that I missed with my kids. I tried really hard to be there for the baseball game or be there for the school play or whatever, and most of the time was successful. But I would have liked to have been able to coach my kids, but there was just no way I could have done that and done my job. It just, as you say, the hours just weren't there. My wife got used to me coming home late or missing dinner or, whatever, because something had to be done. Something had to be covered, story had to be edited. She knows that when there's big breaking news, I'm just going to sort of evaporate as far as the family life goes. And you just have to make peace with that. So again, I think that if you look at what the typical journalist, certainly at our level, does, yourself and our colleagues, and I extend this to to our competitors as well. They work very hard, and by and large, they do a good job. And I think they're underappreciated.
Yeah, and I think we make sacrifices to be in this community.
Yeah.
You, for sure, you could be working if that was your goal, any newspaper in America at a high administrative level. And I could be other places too, but we love this community and we enjoy being able to do the work in this community, which is really involved. They're educated, they love their journalism, they love their news. And then of course it is Santa Barbara and Goleta. It's just a great place to live, but it's a small media market. So we have to make it work and just sort of take the good with the bad. But like you, I really value the journalism. I still get that little good tingly feeling when I see my byline. It used to be like, oh, the print. Now it's in the morning when I wake up. Oh, my story's there, and it feels good because you created something the day before it wasn't there, and now it's there. Let's come back and talk about Noozhawk. Where is Noozhawk headed going forward? We this is a weird media market. We have a daily, we have a weekly, we have citizen journalism with some websites. We have Noozhawk, which is kind of doing the best of all of it, in my opinion. We're small staff, though. What's the outlook here for Noozhawk? You're an owner, you're a manager. Where are we headed with this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Josh. We talk about it a lot, as you can imagine, particularly on the business side, the ownership side. You know, my first big goal in joining Noozhawk 10 years ago was could we prove that if you put out consistently high quality journalism on a regular basis with a good quantity of that, could you make a business that was succeeding? And that's in the context of so many newspapers that are going out of business, that are slashing and burning their staffs. And I've worked in that world, and it's really demoralizing. So the first big question was, could we do that? And that was not a small challenge. When I joined Noozhawk, it was definitely in a developing stage. Bill McFadden, who founded it, was kind of doing everything on the leadership side. There was no real editor. There was no real ad director. And hats off to him. I mean, he was making it work, but it was kind of just barely. And I think he knew that, but then was trying to figure out how to do it through some kind of fortuitous circumstances. I was able to come on board at that time and take over, really running the news department, which is something I do know how to do. And then we were able to get Kim to come on board, Kim Clark, a few months later, and do the same thing on the ad side. And that really was a huge change. It really created the environment for us to go from very small growth across the board to very significant growth. And we have, we went through some tough times. We had a couple of years that, we're kind of barely hanging on financially, but we did. Today, we're on much more solid financial ground. That's due to, I think, just the evolution of the organization. It's due, and to our great gratitude, to a huge amount of financial support from the community, people who join our Hawks Club and value local journalism and are willing to basically just give us money to keep doing what we do. That's made a huge difference in what we do. So I think we thought about, is there a way to, in a sense, scale up Noozhawk? I mean, can you take Noozhawk and go make one in Bakersfield and go make one in, somewhere else? And the answer is you could, but part of the success, we came to realize of Noozhawk was we have all this experience and time spent in this community. Myself, Bill, Kim, you, I mean, if you kind of look across the board. And so in order to replicate that somewhere else, I think you would have to have that same kind of a team. You can't just parachute in and say, here's Noozhawk in a box, now go do it. It really, so much of it comes down to having the right people. And as you well know, Santa Barbara is a town that is, so much is based on relationships.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like a big city, but it's really a small town, and it's so much of its relationships. And I don't know how you replicate that on a franchise kind of basis. So our current plans are just to continue to grow, probably do more in the North County, because we only really have one person consistently working up there. We'd like to be able to focus more on specific communities, dig more deeply into Montecito, for example, and also into some topics that we do certainly cover. But if we had more staff and more resources, we could cover better and more deeply. Planning and development is an obvious one. There are other issues, healthcare, mental health. Again, we touch on those, but our hope and expectation is to continue to slowly add to the size of our staff. We added 2 positions in the heat of the pandemic, which is really counterintuitive. We added a reporter and we added a salesperson. And we knew there was some risk to doing that, but we felt like we had a lot of momentum, and that would really help us get more momentum and have more success. And it basically did. So, we're fairly conservative. I don't mean politically, I mean just in terms of how we run our business. We are really careful about how we spend money, but we also try to, make sure that we're making those tactical and strategic investments that allow us to continue to see success. And our budget and our situation is very stable right now. And absent something that nobody could see coming, I think we'll continue to steadily grow and get bigger and better.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to touch on a couple of points I hear out there all the time. Two things. I love Noozhawk because you guys aren't biased. You just tell the news. You're down the middle. And that's what I want. Okay. I hear that more often than anything else. I also hear, you're a little bit conservative. Sometimes for some people, being down the middle is being conservative. It's not, where they want their news to be. And so I asked Bill McFadden this when I had him on the show, and I want to just sort of talk to you. For those people in the community who think, oh, Noozhawk is the conservative outlet and the weekly's the liberal outfit, and the other papers, the real far right, what is Noozhawk? I mean, can you explain to that? We don't do endorsements, but there can be a perception sometimes that we're not to the left enough. Can you talk about what that is?
Well, we're not to the left, nor are we to the right. I mean, our goal is to be right down the middle, and I'm talking about the news operations now. Nobody should be able to read our stories and know what my politics are, what your politics are, what Janine's, Gianna's, any of our staff members. They should not be able to know that. And I would defy them to point to a story and say that points to a XYZ bias. It just doesn't. We don't do endorsements. We don't write editorials. We allow other people to do that. We try to provide a broad spectrum of opinions, in the opinion section. I've heard people say, yeah, we're too conservative, we're too liberal. I mean, kind of, you're getting complaints from both sides. I feel like we're in a pretty good place. I mean, clearly Bill McFadden has his views, and he expresses those in his column. And as he says at the beginning of every column, those are his opinions. And I think some people probably, from that draw a conclusion that, well, somehow that means, I don't think there's any secret that Bill is to the right of center. That somehow means that, that's affecting the news, but it's not. I mean, not once has Bill ever given me any kind of a direction or push that I would say, came from, a political point of view. He'll raise issues, usually good issues, but in the end, he leaves it to the news staff to decide, what we're going to cover, how we're going to cover it. And, I don't think you can ask for really much more than that.
Yeah. Okay. And I want to ask you, you've mentored so many students over the years, young journalists, and you talk about being in the Daily Nexus. You've hired people over the years. You've had to let people go. You've nurtured people. What advice do you have to journalists out there? Because as we know, to be a journalist today is not the same as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Money's different. You're expected to do more things. Like when I was hired at the News Press, they would just write stories. We had a photography staff, and now a lot of, not just Noozhawk, everywhere you go, you're going to have to be a multimedia journalist. You got to take pictures, sometimes shoot photo, write stories. What advice do you have to people getting in the industry?
Well, I mean, some of it's the kind of Boy Scout stuff, which is, work hard and, eat your vegetables, etc. But I think, when people ask for advice, as in terms of journalism, there's a few things I pretty much come back to. One is read as many good journalists as you can anywhere. I don't care where they work. Find good journalists and read them and try to understand what it is about the way they do their job that makes those stories good. I think working on writing is hard. Most of us who go into this business are good writers, generally good writers. But the best writers I know anguish over it. They work really hard about word choices and transitions and, I mean, everything. And if you stop doing that, then your writing kind of flattens out, and it's not that it's bad, but so I really encourage people to do that. Read a lot of everything. I think just reading is really important. I think in today's world, developing multiple skill sets, it's not enough to know how to report and write. You need to understand how social media works. You need to understand how data works, how spreadsheets work. And I think getting experience in all those areas and getting trained in all those areas is really important. And like you said, I mean, today you have to know how to get images. You have to theoretically know how to do videos. And I think they teach a lot of that today in the journalism schools that certainly we didn't learn when, I mean, I consider myself an old dog. I certainly try to learn the new tricks, but there's stuff that's going on today that just blows me away. And it's just really cool stuff. And I mean, just this podcast is, these things didn't really exist much 10 or 15 years ago. And today they're out there. And so it's just another channel, if you will, for, conveying the journalism.
Yeah. Well, you've reinvented yourself really well as anybody over the years. I mean, well, how many of our colleagues over the years have gone into PR, or they just did something else, and you've just been a journalist this whole time, and, you're on Twitter and social media. I mean, that's not a fun world. I mean, it's such a puzzle. It's a mystery. Like, how do you get social media? But, you're there figuring it out. So.
Yeah. Well, I've always been a curious person. I think that's another thing. If you're going to be a journalist, you have to just be naturally curious. Yeah. If you're not, then you really should go into another line of work, because, one of the great things about being a journalist is that we get to ask the nosy questions. We get to ask the question everybody's wanting to ask, but they're too polite, or you're not supposed to ask that question. And we get to go ask it and then get the answer and then tell everybody. And that's kind of cool. But you have to be curious about life, and I'm really grateful. I mean, I've had some, my downs in life and in my career, but it's always led me somewhere good. And I think the other advice I have for people is going back to what we were talking about earlier, is you just have to have some stamina and perseverance and keep moving ahead, and recognizing that things aren't always going to go the way you want, and some stuff may happen. And certainly in today's industry with layoffs and some of that other stuff, I think that can be very demoralizing. But never in the history of the world has there been more information out there and more of a need for somebody to help make sense of that information. And that's really what we do as journalists. Is our job is to go out and try to understand it and then convey that in some, clear and intelligent way. And so the need is greater. So the question is, what's the model? What's whether it's a model of how do you make a living, or how do you make a business a going concern? People are figuring that out. I mean, that's been one of the challenges of Noozhawk, is that, newspapers essentially have been the same for 150 years. And for most of that time, they were very lucrative. You didn't really have to be good. You just had to have a big sack to put your money in. That has changed over the last, 20, 30 years. And so now you have this new thing, and we're trying to figure out, well, what's the model that for the next thing, for the digital journalism world. And I think a lot of what we've done at Noozhawk is proving out, but who knows? I mean, who knows what it's going to be in 5 years, 10 years? I mean, at some point I'm going to age out, and so it's going to become your problem and the young people's problem, or challenge. I don't want to say problem, to figure out what's next. But it's exciting. I mean, I think all the stuff that's happening online, and how quickly we can get information out to people today. I mean, if you think back to when you started at the news press, I think we were still using this stuff called film. You remember film? You put it into the cameras and they took pictures, and then you'd have to take that film and go develop it. And then you'd have to edit it and then either scan it or make prints or what have you. Whereas today, you can be at the scene with your phone, take an image, text it to me, and I can have that online in minutes, if not seconds. As opposed to, well, we'll give you the photo tomorrow morning in the morning edition. So, I mean, that's exciting. I think it's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, I want to give you the last word here, Tom. We talked about Noozhawk going forward. Obviously, people are going to be tuning into this. They're going to have some familiarity with you and I and Noozhawk. But for those of you who, for those people out there who don't know what to find at Noozhawk, what to expect from Noozhawk, can you just talk about what stands out in the world of journalism that we have in this community? What's your best sort of take on why Noozhawk is special?
Well, we've talked about a lot of the aspects, I think, Josh. We see our job is providing as much news and information about our community as we can on a consistent basis, certainly a daily basis, and really more than a daily basis. Frequent readers of Noozhawk know that you'll see stuff in the morning, but then there'll be stuff posted throughout the day. Certainly, breaking news is something we focus on because we know that's really important to readers. But we also know that just as important is, what's happening in City Hall, what's happening in our schools, what's happening with our nonprofit community, which we've been, very aligned with and do a lot of coverage of, and they've been very supportive of Noozhawk. We have an unparalleled operation covering local sports. So I think that, what is Noozhawk? It's the modern day version of the daily newspaper. And certainly, some of our colleagues in other organizations in the community do some good work. I'm a believer in journalism in general, so I like to see as much journalism as possible. We don't have a monopoly on good work in journalism, but for consistently getting that news and information, which includes our advertising. People don't always think about that, but advertising is important information too. It's important, of course, for the advertiser, but also for the people receiving it. They want to know about stuff that's going on in that part of our world. So yeah, again, I just think that if you're looking for that and you want it in a form that doesn't have an agenda, is not is completely, targeting being unbiased, being fair. We try really hard to be first, but I always tell our staff and I tell the community, more important than being first for us is getting it right. And we see too many situations where other people don't get it right because they're in such a hurry. So, that's what we are. That's what we will continue to be. Again, we've had tremendous support on all levels from the community. And I think you said something really important that I would maybe want to close in is we are part of the community. I've lived in Santa Barbara County for more than 40 some years. And, I love this community, not just because it's a beautiful place and all that, but because, this is where I've spent most of my adult life. This is where my kids were born and grew up. And, I'm committed, and I think our staff is committed to doing the best we can to serve that community that we love.
Yeah, well said. And just know, Tom, you can never retire because
That's becoming apparent.
I always, not always, but sometimes I'll occasionally tweet, look how much work I did, just because I guess I'm feeling, needing.
You do a lot of work, Josh.
But you do. I mean, you really do a lot of work consistently, and it's very inspirational. So I hope you are always at Noozhawk, because you set the pace in so many different ways. But thanks a lot for your time, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Okay, take care.